If you look at the history of the spread of ideas across the planet, in the last few centuries even, what I refer to as socially useful quote-unquote piracy has been part of it. If you look at in the development of new industry around the world, even in the United States, back in the beginning of the 19th century, very famous example from the British point of view, ideas were quote-unquote stolen. Very famously, the British actually forbade the export of textile know-how, textile machinery know-how, and the Americans quite reasonably got round that because they wanted to create a textile industry. And the Japanese have done that in 50 years ago, and the Chinese are doing this now, and that's going to happen. That doesn't mean that it isn't reasonable for people who own these assets to try and preserve them, but they do have to expect ideas will flow. That's the nature of ideas. Ideas want to be free, as it were. That's a really pretty basic thing. If they're in people's heads, it's really difficult to stop them from walking out the door and starting a new business using a variant. You can try. You can try to get the Chinese government on your side, but it's a country of 1.3 billion people. They can't really police everything. We know they can't. It's a very rough and ready system. So I agree with the fundamental premise that in the long run, at least in the technology areas where the patenting area, copyright is a bit different, the way you will succeed if you're GE or any such company is just to keep on innovating. In any case, if you don't, you're going to be dead because somebody is going to kill you. The idea, you aren't going to live on past patents as a major industry for very long. And I think all the major companies understand that. At the same time, it is clearly true that if they sense that the Chinese government will protect them somewhat, it will increase their incentive to produce in China and other developing countries, and that is in the interests of developing countries. So a middle level and upper, rapidly growing developing countries, providing some IP protection is reasonable. In the case of copyright, as I've indicated, the interests are not so obvious. One of the examples I gave yesterday is that there used to be, I don't know the situation, pretty well wholesale piracy by Indians, publishers of textbooks. Now, the truth is, Indians could never pay Western textbook prices. If they insisted on Western textbook prices, textbooks would not have been available in India, and people could not have studied them. It seems to be unambiguously the case that the world is better off if the Indians could pirate these textbooks and allow Indians to read and learn. They weren't sold in the West. They didn't come into the West. In fact, it was very much in India. It's a very good example of what I think of as socially useful piracy. And the spread of books across the world is, I think, broadly a good thing. So we have to understand there are benefits in certain ways to the IP system, broadly defined, but there are also costs, and in some cases the costs are very high. Another example, which I think is very important, is software. It is actually important that software be spread around the world. I think some of the major software companies have been essentially granted a license to exploit. One can have a real question of whether a private company should have a monopoly on an operating system, as Microsoft have. It's a really interesting philosophical and economic question. But if it does have such a monopoly, it has to be exercised in a socially useful way. And it does seem to me clear that we want software to spread around the world. We want it to be used in emerging countries. I think Microsoft now understands this as well. And we don't want them to pay the same price as rich people in the West if we can find some ways around it. So we really do have to understand the really important thing about ideas. We want them to be used. We don't want them to be monopolized. We don't want them to become impossibly expensive. And that's also true of creative products.